They laughed when a bankrupt man adopted a homeless girl, but what the world didn't know was that this girl carried a secret powerful enough to expose a global lie. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a genius built in the shadows, and when they tried to erase her, she rewrote history instead. This is the story of Elara. This is not just a story. It's a piece of someone's hidden pain quietly waiting to be heard. In today's story, we dive into a moment that can change everything, in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Canada? The US? Norway? Let us know in the comments, because stories may begin anywhere, but they connect us all. Stay with us until the very end, because sometimes what breaks your heart can also heal it. And if you believe stories can change lives, hit subscribe. Join our journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. Your voice matters here. The wind clawed at the rusted iron gate, as if trying to pry open the secrets buried beneath the mansion's crumbling walls. Once, the estate stood as a testament to power. Its marble pillars gleamed like moonlight, and its garden bloomed with rare roses imported from all over the world. But now it sat hollow and weary like the man who still called it home. Edward Langston, former tech mogul, billionaire inventor, and media darling, now wandered its halls like a ghost, the echo of his leather shoes swallowed by the silence. Once hailed as the visionary of Silicon Valley, he'd lost everything in a catastrophic collapse. Stocks plummeted. Investors fled. The media turned him into a cautionary tale, and perhaps worst of all, people laughed. Not out of cruelty, but pity. Like watching a lion defanged and put on display at a circus. Edward had grown quiet, his brilliant mind frayed with shame. He lived with ghosts now. His late wife's laughter, the boardroom applause, the soft hum of his invention, the LuxCore chip that once promised to change the world. One rainy evening, in a moment of unbearable loneliness, he drove aimlessly through the city's underbelly. The part he had ignored during his years atop the world. And that's when he saw her. Barefoot, soaked, curled up against a dumpster. Her eyes hidden beneath tangled curls and a coat 3 sizes too big. He didn't know why he stopped. He didn't know what compelled him to step out into the rain. He didn't know that his life, already stripped bare, was about to begin again. He only knew one thing. When he told the world he was adopting a homeless girl, they laughed harder than ever. But Edward Langston had no idea, no one did, that this girl was hiding a mind that would stun the world. A girl who would rebuild everything he lost, and then some. Her name was Elara, and this is their story. The rain was a relentless percussion on the windshield, smearing the world outside into a blur of neon lights and dripping shadows. Edward Langston gripped the steering wheel of his decade-old Mercedes like it was the last thread tying him to sanity. The car groaned with age every time he hit a pothole, a far cry from the sleek self-driving models he once funded. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't sit in that mansion anymore. The Langston estate had once been a palace of vision. The driveway used to sparkle with imported stone. The fountain sang water symphonies in the morning, and inside, intelligent lighting danced with the sunrise like a ritual. Now, it smelled of mildew, and the chandelier in the foyer had gathered a gray coat of dust, like everything else he owned. He didn't even flinch when the rain blurred the red light ahead. He wasn't afraid of crashes anymore. But what he saw at the next corner made him hit the brakes so hard the car jerked violently. A child. No, not a child exactly. Older, maybe 12, maybe 14. It was hard to tell. She was huddled near a dumpster outside an abandoned restaurant, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, shoulders trembling with the cold. A threadbare coat hung from her frame like forgotten laundry, and one shoe was missing. But it wasn't the sight of her that struck Edward. It was her eyes. They flicked open the moment his headlights found her. Wide, unblinking, ancient. Not frightened. Not pleading. Just watching. Edward parked the car without thinking. He stepped into the cold, his expensive leather shoes splashing into a puddle. The rain plastered his coat to his back in seconds. But he didn't care. "You okay?" He called gently, unsure of what else to say. She didn't answer. She just stared, her eyes flicking to his hands, then to his face, as if scanning him like a machine. "What's your name?" "Nothing." He took another step. "I won't hurt you." Still nothing. Then, just barely audible over the rain, she whispered, "Why would you care?" That simple sentence hit Edward harder than any blow ever could. Because she was right. Why would he care? Why would a man like him, ruined, mocked, alone, care about a girl like her? "I don't know," he admitted, voice low. "Maybe because I've lost everything, and I know what it feels like to be forgotten." There was a long pause. Her fingers gripped her knees tighter. He took off his coat and held it out to her. "Please," he said. "Just come with me. I won't make you stay. Just one warm night." Till she hesitated. Then slowly, so slowly it looked like pain, she stood. She took the coat, but not his hand. That night, Edward brought her to the Langston mansion. The security system still worked, barely, and the door creaked open like a sigh from a ghost. She stepped inside warily, eyes darting around the cavernous space, taking in every detail. She said nothing. He led her to the guest wing, where once senators and CEOs had stayed. The sheets were clean at least. He brought her hot soup, turned on the fireplace, and left her alone. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't give hers. When he checked on her later, she was already asleep, curled on top of the blanket like an animal used to fleeing at any moment. Her face, in rest, was beautiful. Sharp cheekbones under smudges of grime, lips slightly parted. Brows furrowed as if even dreams gave her no peace. He stood there for a long time, watching this tiny mystery in his bed. He should have taken her to a shelter, called child services. But something in his gut, something deep, told him she was different. And he hadn't felt something deep in years. In the morning, she was gone. But so was the broken toaster on the kitchen counter, replaced with a perfectly functional device, repaired using leftover circuitry from a smart mirror Edward hadn't touched in months. He blinked. How? Before he could even search the estate, he heard footsteps in the garage. He rushed down and stopped dead at the doorway. There she was, hunched over the frame of his old, disassembled drone prototype. Wires splayed around her like spilled noodles. Soldering iron in hand, eyes sharp with focus. When she heard him, she didn't flinch. She turned, lifted the drone controller, and pressed a button. The drone sprang to life, hovering with perfect stability, the lights blinking in perfect sync. Your wiring schema was sloppy, she said calmly. I fixed it. Edward's jaw dropped. His drone design was proprietary. No schematics, no manuals, and it had taken 3 engineers to get the prototype off the ground the first time. Who are you? He whispered. She turned, and for the first time, gave him a full answer. My name is Elara, she said, and I don't need your charity. Then she turned back to the drone. The morning after the drone incident, Edward Langston sat in his once proud dining room, holding a steaming mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. The grand table, hand-carved from Italian oak, stretched out before him like a metaphor for everything that used to be grand in his life, long, empty, and collecting dust. Across from him sat Elara. She had refused to shower, refused new clothes, refused the room he'd offered again. She sat curled into the same oversized coat, arms crossed, staring at him like a detective evaluating a suspect. For a girl who had slept beside trash bins and scraped for food, she carried herself like royalty, unkempt yet undeniably in control. He cleared his throat. You fixed the drone. I know. No one could figure out that calibration issue for 3 years. Maybe you were looking at it wrong, she said, picking at the torn fabric of her sleeve. You grounded the motor to the wrong node. Edward blinked. And how do you know that? She didn't answer. She just looked down and muttered, I rid fast. Edward leaned back in his chair. He was trying to piece her together, but she had too many missing parts. She was like a puzzle made from 3 different boxes. Nothing quite fit. I want to help you, he said, carefully. Food, clothes, school, anything you need. No school, she snapped, eyes hard. Ever, he hesitated. Why not? They're not built for people like me. Like you? People who already know everything in their textbooks? She said plainly and not with pride. More like a quiet curse. I see, he said, nodding slowly. So you're gifted. She met his gaze and didn't blink. I'm not gifted. Edward studied her. The raw intelligence was obvious. But there was something else beneath it, something scarred. Something broken. He tried again. I don't want to force you into anything. But if you stay here, there have to be some boundaries. She smirked. Like what? Curfew. Bedtime. Like no rewiring my security system without asking. She shrugged. Your firewall was a joke. You hacked into my system. She pulled a small device from her pocket and slid it across the table. It was a handmade microprocessor with custom circuits etched by hand and a salvaged chip he recognized from an old smart fridge in the basement. I was bored. Edward couldn't decide whether to laugh or panic. She sat up straighter, her voice cold now. Look, I don't care about your pity. I'll stay one more night. But you don't get to ask about my past. You don't touch my things. And you don't pretend I'm some charity case. He frowned. You think I see you that way? Everyone does. He let out a long breath. All right, Elara. Then we'll do this your way. What do you want? She paused for the first time as if she hadn't actually expected the question. Tools, she said eventually. A workstation. Something real. Not toy kits. I need gear. Okay. What else? A locked room? With no cameras? Edward blinked. What for? I need space to work, she said. And you said you'd help. Her tone made it clear this was non-negotiable. Fine, he said, you get it. On one condition. She raised an eyebrow. You tell me one thing about yourself every week. Just one. Not much. Just something true. And Elara hesitated, then nodded slowly. Deal. That evening, Edward took her to what used to be his underground data lab. He hadn't used it in over a year. It smelled of stale air and rust, but it was still intact. Computers lined the walls, and the far corner had a reinforced workbench with built-in power hubs. She explored it like a cat exploring a forgotten attic. He watched her eyes light up in a way that broke his heart a little. "Everything in here is yours," he said. She nodded, then turned to him. "My name wasn't always Elara," she said quietly. "I gave myself that name last year." Edward blinked. "Why?" She turned back to the bench, her hands tracing the edge. "Because my real name belonged to someone weak." Then she pulled her coat tighter and got to work, soldering components with the precision of a seasoned engineer. Edward stood there in silence watching this girl, this impossible, guarded, brilliant girl, bring dead machines back to life. And for the first time in years, a flicker of something stirred in his chest. Hope. But as he walked back up the stairs, a notification pinged on the old tablet he hadn't touched in months. Emotion alert. He frowned, opened it. The footage showed Elara entering the lab, but the timestamp was wrong. It was from the night before she'd arrived. Edward's heart thudded. She had already been inside his house, before he ever invited her in. The girl who knew too much. Edward sat in the dim glow of his old tablet, the screen's pale light casting shadows across his tired face. He rewound the footage again, just to be sure. The date was clear. 2 nights before he'd found Elara near the dumpster, she had already been inside his home, through the garage, into the lab, and out again, vanishing like a whisper. No signs of a break-in, no alarm. Just her. He stared at the paused image, Elara, dirty coat and all, walking with purpose through a secured estate like she'd lived there her whole life. He exhaled sharply, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. Who was this girl? The next morning, Edward cooked breakfast himself, scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice from the last can in the pantry. He wasn't sure she'd come. But when he turned around, Elara was already standing in the kitchen doorway, hands in her coat pockets watching him. "You always watch people like that?" he asked. "Only when they're pretending," she replied flatly. He smiled faintly. "And what am I pretending?" "That you're not scared of me." Edward gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, eat, then we'll talk." She sat reluctantly, eyeing the food with suspicion. He noticed the way she scanned everything first. The angles, exits, objects within reach. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. And it wasn't something learned from books. He took a bite of toast. "So, you want to explain why there's footage of you sneaking into my house 2 nights before we met?" Elara froze. Her fork hovered in midair. Then she put it down. "I needed parts," she said finally. "I was going to take some soldering wire. That's all. And you knew how to bypass a multi-layer encrypted security system to get it? I've seen worse." "We're." She didn't answer. Her eyes dropped to her lap. Edward leaned forward. "I'm not angry, Elara. I'm worried. About you. About what you've seen. About what you've done to survive." "I didn't take anything," she whispered. "I know," he said gently. "But that's not the point." She finally looked up, and something behind her eyes cracked for a fraction of a second. Something raw and filtered. "Do you want me to leave?" He shook his head. "No." She stared at him. "Even after knowing I broke into your house? You're not just some thief, Elara. You're someone who's had to outthink the world just to breathe. I don't know how or why, but I want to understand." She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the tile. Then, after a long pause, she muttered, "I wasn't always on the street." Edward stood too slowly. "Tell me." She looked at the window, not him. There was a place. A facility. I don't remember its name. They told me it was for smart kids. But it wasn't a school, he frowned. "What was it?" "Experiments," she said, voice flat. "Tests. Not medical. Intellectual. Psychological. They wanted to measure how far a mind could be stretched. How much input a brain could absorb without breaking." Edward felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And you were part of this?" She nodded. "There were others. A few of us. Most didn't last." "What do you mean didn't last?" "They snapped," she whispered. "Or stopped eating. Or disappeared in the middle of the night. My God, I escaped," she said. "I waited for a night when the electric grid glitched. I knew it would. They ran outdated power systems. I shorted the door locks and ran." Edward didn't speak for a moment. His mind reeled. "None of this should have happened. How old were you?" he asked softly. 10. He sank back down into his chair. Elara's hands trembled, but her eyes remained dry. "They called me Subject 7E. I hated that name, so I gave myself a new one. After a moon that doesn't exist anymore." "Elara," he breathed. "You asked for something true every week," she said, swallowing hard. "That's this week's truth." He wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, but something in her posture said not yet, maybe not ever. So instead, he said, "You're safe now, I promise." She looked at him with a flicker of disbelief. "No one's ever safe." He didn't argue. That afternoon, Edward drove into the city and returned with 2 large crates of electronics. Circuit boards, processors, touch screens, heat sensors, lithium packs. When she saw them, her eyes widened. "No questions," he said. Build whatever you want. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. But that night when he checked the footage again, she hadn't left the lab once. At 30:12 m, she turned to the camera, directly at it, and wrote something on the whiteboard. 2 words, "They're watching." Edward froze. Who was they? And what did they want with a girl like Elara? Strangers in the system. The phrase, "They're watching," was scrawled in thick red marker across the whiteboard in his lab, the letters uneven but deliberate. It stared at him like a warning written in blood. He stood there in the silence of the early morning, rereading it as if it would suddenly change meaning if he stared long enough. Elara hadn't said another word about it. She'd spent the entire day locked in the lab with her headphones on, soldering wires, adjusting microchips, and sketching diagrams that made Edward feel like a toddler trying to understand calculus. He watched through the corner security feed, not to spy, but to make sure she was still breathing. Her movements were robotic, efficient, obsessive, and the truth buzzed in the back of his brain like a mosquito he couldn't swat someone else knew about her. Someone dangerous. He opened his old laptop, one of the few pieces of tech he hadn't sold or donated after the collapse. It was dusty, slow, and had no connection to the cloud, which made it perfect for what he needed. He started with government data leaks, missing children databases, secret educational facilities, experimental programs. He searched for phrases like Subject 7E, youth intelligence trials, and undocumented gifted experiments. He read archived articles from obscure tech blogs, whistleblower forums, and dark web message boards. Most of it was garbage, conspiracies, clickbait, and pixelated screenshots. But then, buried on an encrypted discussion board for ex-defense contractors, he found a thread titled Project Helix Unethical, Untraceable, and Still Running. The thread mentioned a clandestine program allegedly run by private tech firms in cooperation with a few rogue government agencies. It spoke of abandoned facilities, children trained to develop AI algorithms from the age of 5, biometric response testing, memory suppression trials, and intelligence-enhancing simulations. No names, no locations, just stories, scattered puzzle pieces. But one post, anonymous and timestamped 6 years ago, chilled him to the bone. One girl outperformed all parameters: photographic memory, multi-threaded logic processing, cognitive recursion at 95% efficiency. We called her 7E. She vanished after a lockdown failure. The facility denied she ever existed. If she's out there, she's not just dangerous. She's the key. Edward slammed the laptop shut, chest pounding. He stared at the ceiling, forcing himself to breathe. Elara wasn't just smart. She was built for something far bigger than either of them understood. And someone, somewhere, knew it. That evening, Edward approached the lab door and knocked softly. Elara. There was a pause, then the sound of something clicking off. The door opened an inch. What? I need to talk to you. She hesitated, then let him in. The room was transformed. Every surface was covered in machinery. Half-built drones, rewired tablets, a dismantled 3D printer that she had apparently fused with parts from his old coffee machine. Wires hung from the ceiling. Data streams flickered on multiple monitors. In the center, a strange-looking cube hovered slightly above a platform, glowing faintly blue.
What is that?
He asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "You searched for me, didn't you?" He nodded.
Yes. And now you're scared. Yes. Good,
she whispered. Elara, who were they? The ones watching? She walked over to a table, picked up a microcontroller, and rolled it between her fingers. Not who.
What? He frowned.
Explain. There's a signal, she said. Encrypted, passive, buried in the spectrum between Wi-Fi and satellite relays. It's not human-made, at least not by any standard protocol. I picked it up last week. He stared at her. You're saying there's a non-traceable frequency watching us?
Yes.
And it followed you from the facility? She shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe I was the test all along? Maybe they want to see what I build when I'm free? That's insane, Edward muttered. That's science fiction. No, she said, her voice quiet. That's science. She turned to the hovering cube. I've been building a cloaking relay. If I can finish it, we'll disappear from the signal grid entirely. Like we never existed. Edward stepped closer. And if you can't? Elara looked at him with eyes too old for her age. Then they come. There was a long silence. Then she said, You still want me here? Edward didn't hesitate.
Yes.
She nodded, then handed him a small black object. What's this? A modified tracker. You wear it. If I tell you to run, you run. If I disappear, it shows you where to find me. Edward stared at her. Why are you giving me this? Because for the first time, she whispered, I think someone might actually care if I vanish. She walked back to the table and began working again. And Edward, still holding the tracker, knew that the mansion, his crumbling fortress of shame, was no longer just home to a fallen millionaire. It was now ground zero for something that would shake the world. Outside, somewhere far beyond the city, a satellite lens flickered to life. its heat signature focused on a single point, the Langston estate. And somewhere in a cold, quiet facility, a terminal blinked. 7E located. The first warning. The first warning came not with a bang but a whisper. It was 20:37 a.m. when the power in the Langston estate flickered for the first time in months. Edward sat up straight in bed, his breath catching in his throat. The silence that followed was unnerving. No hum of electricity, no software of the automated heater Elara had restored last week. Just nothing. Then a low, rhythmic pulsing started. Faint. Like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. He grabbed the small black tracker Elara had given him and rushed toward the lab. When he opened the heavy door, he saw her. Elara sat cross-legged in the center of the room, surrounded by tools, wires, and scattered blueprints. The cube she'd built now glowed fiercely, casting a pale light over her face like a rising moon. Her eyes were closed, fingers pressed lightly against her temples. "Elara," Edward whispered. She opened her eyes slowly, and they were glowing. Not with light, not literally, but with something electric. Alive. "It's starting," she said softly.
What is? They've found the signal,
She said, standing with a calm that only made Edward more afraid. "I knew they would. I left a fragment behind, on purpose. I needed to see if they were still monitoring." "You baited them?" "Yes." "Elara." "Why?" "Because I needed proof. For you. And for me." Edward's voice sharpened. "And what if they'd come in guns blazing?" She smiled bitterly. "They won't risk that." "Not yet. I'm too valuable." He looked at the cube. "What is that thing really?" She reached out and tapped it. "A decoy. It mimics my signal signature. If they track it, they'll think I'm in 3 places at once. But it's temporary. They'll figure it out soon." The floor beneath them vibrated slightly. Edward stiffened. "Elara?" She raised her hand. "It's okay. They won't breach tonight." As if on cue, the pulsing stopped. The power came back, lights flickered, then stabilized. The estate exhaled, but Edward felt no relief. "I need to know what we're dealing with," he said. "All of it. No more secrets." Elara stared at the cube for a long moment, then slowly sat back down. "You ever hear of the Theta Project?" Edward's stomach turned. "Only rumors. Urban legends. Some say it was about building predictive AI. Others say it was human enhancement." Elara nodded. "Both are true." She pulled a thin chip from her pocket. Black, barely bigger than a fingernail. "This was implanted in me. Subdermally, near the base of my skull." Edward's heart raced. "You removed it yourself?" She nodded. "It took me 4 hours. No anesthesia. Just mirrors. I couldn't let them find me again." He sat down across from her, overwhelmed. "They wanted to create a generation of minds that could think faster than machines," she explained. "Kids whose thoughts could bend logic, solve chaos theory before puberty. But they pushed too hard. Too fast." "What did they do to you?" "They fed us simulations. Hundreds every day. We lived in artificial environments, sometimes for days, sometimes weeks. They accelerated time perception, made our brains think we'd been awake for months. When they unplugged us, only hours had passed. That's inhumane. It worked," she said quietly, "but most of us didn't survive it. Not mentally. And you did." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she whispered, barely. Edward leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What do they want from you now?" Elara's jaw clenched. "They want to erase me, or worse. Repurpose me. Repurpose. I'm not a person to them, Edward. I'm a template. A success story they can replicate. If they get me, they'll copy me. Clone my thought structures. Turn me into an operating system. My consciousness in every smart device on Earth." Edward paled. "That's insane. That's evolution," she said. "At least the version they believe in." A loud crack echoed outside, like a firecracker splitting open the night. They both froze. Edward rushed to the security monitor. One of the surveillance cameras had been fried. It screened nothing but static. Elara was already pulling out a metal case. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Plan B," she said. "We need to move the decoy. Hide the signal somewhere else." She opened the case. Inside was a miniature drone. Sleek, fast, unlike anything Edward had seen before. She clipped the cube to its underside and typed a string of commands into her makeshift controller. "Where are you sending it?" "To the rooftop of a corporate building downtown," she said. "One they monitor." The drone buzzed to life, and within seconds, it zipped out of the open attic vent, vanishing into the night sky. Elara turned to Edward. "We bought ourselves 2 days. Maybe less. Then what?" "Then we disappear." Edward stared at her. "How do you just disappear, Elara?" She looked at him, and this time, there was no trace of cold calculation, only the vulnerability of a child still running from nightmares. "You burn everything behind you," she whispered. "And you never look back." He nodded slowly. But neither of them knew that as the drone zipped through the city, a figure in a darkened van just outside the Langston estate lowered a thermal imaging scope and spoke into a secure radio line. "Target confirmed. Subject 7E is active." The Langston estate had always been quiet, but now silence felt weaponized. The air was too still, the shadows too sharp. Edward stood at the window of his study, watching the tree line beyond his property, heart pounding in his chest like a warning bell. Somewhere out there, unseen and calculating, was the force Elara feared most. And now they were watching. He turned to face her. Elara, standing in the center of the room with her tangled hair tied back, backpack slung over one shoulder, and a tiny chip clenched between her fingers. "This is it," she said, voice low. "We initiate the escape protocol now, or we won't get another chance." Edward swallowed hard. "Are you sure they're coming?" And she nodded once. "I intercepted a bounce signal from a government satellite 40 minutes ago. It matched the triangulation signature from the old facility. They've zeroed in on us, Stein. Then let's call the police. They won't get here in time, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. The people coming, they're not wearing badges." Edward didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. "What's the plan?" Elara unrolled a blueprint across the table. It was a map of the house, though house now seemed like the wrong word. It was a maze of rooms, wiring, and escape hatches Edward had almost forgotten he built back when paranoia was fashionable in tech circles. "There's a hidden tunnel under the garage," Elara said. "Goes 3 blocks north, comes out behind the abandoned warehouse on 7th. We use it." He blinked. "You found the tunnel. I rerouted your security schematics the first night. I found everything." Of course she had. Edward grabbed the duffel bag he'd packed old burner phones, cash he'd kept for emergencies, water, power bars, and a loaded USB drive with his last working AI prototype, just in case they needed leverage. Elara tossed him a black hoodie. "Wear this. The drones can't track low, contrast thermal profiles in dark clothing. You're telling me you've outsmarted aerial surveillance, too?" "No," she said with a dry smile. "I'm telling you I already did, 3 times. She walked to the wall beside the fireplace and knocked twice. A soft hiss answered as a hidden panel slid open, revealing the narrow passage that would lead them beneath the house. But just as they were about to enter, Edward paused. "What happens after we escape? We disappear?" she said without looking back. "And then what? We live on the run? Forever? Until we find who built the Theta Project and shut it down?" Edward blinked. "You want to go after them? They won't stop," she said. "Not just for me. There are others, Edward, other kids, buried in labs, forgotten in facilities no one talks about. If I don't stop them, who will?" There was no bitterness in her voice, just steel. Like a soldier too young for war, but too smart to pretend it wasn't already here. Edward's voice was soft. "You're 14, Elara. I was 13 when I escaped. Time works differently when your mind runs at 10 times the speed of everyone else." He couldn't argue with that. They stepped into the passage and sealed the panel behind them. The tunnel was damp and tight, barely wide enough for them to walk shoulder to shoulder. Cobwebs brushed against Edward's face, and the faint scent of rust and wet soil filled the air. The silence was broken only by the faint click of Elara's tablet, tracking the drone signal they had launched as a decoy. After 10 minutes, the passage ended at a rusted steel door. Elara tapped her screen, and the magnetic lock disengaged with a hiss. They stepped into a wide storage chamber, an old warehouse, abandoned years ago. Moonlight poured through shattered windows, painting the dust in silver streaks. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A car rolled by. The real world felt both comforting and distant. Edward leaned against a pillar and exhaled. "Made it. For now." Elara pulled out her backpack and unzipped it. Inside was a dense metal case, more high-tech than anything Edward had seen at Langston Labs. She flipped it open. "What is that?" "My failsafe," she said. "A quantum compression drive. Holds every piece of data I've recovered. Schematics, experiments, names, facility blueprints. If something happens to me, this gets leaked to every major journalist and watchdog in the world." Edward's eyes widened. "You planned for your own death?" "No," she said simply. "I planned for war." Suddenly a soft ping echoed from her tablet. Elara's eyes flicked to the screen. Her face went white. "They're here," she whispered. They didn't take the bait. Edward stepped forward. "How close?" She held up the tablet. "They're not outside." His blood ran cold. "They're inside the estate." Well, she looked at him, voice tight. "We have to move now." Suddenly, from across the warehouse, a soft metallic voice echoed from a dark corner. Elara 7 Echo. "Surrender peacefully." They turned. A figure stepped from the shadows. Dressed in matte black, no insignia, face masked, holding a pulse weapon glowing blue. Edward pulled Elara behind him, heart thundering. But she didn't cower. Instead, she stared at the figure and whispered, "You're not here to capture me." The figure stepped forward, weapon raised. "You're here to erase me." The moment hung in a breathless standoff. Elara's mind was racing, calculating angles, distances, probabilities of survival. Her eyes scanned the figure's stance, the weapon's charge indicator, the lack of insignia. This wasn't a retrieval team. This wasn't an arrest. This was an execution. The agent's pulse weapon hummed louder as he stepped closer, his voice hollow behind the mask. Target confirmed. Subject 7E. Termination protocol authorized. Edward moved instinctively, putting himself between Elara and the gun. "She's a child," he shouted. "You can't." A searing beam shot past Edward's shoulder, striking the metal beam behind him with a burst of electric sparks. He flinched. The air itself sizzled with heat. "Next shot won't miss," the voice warned. But Elara was already moving. With a flick of her wrist, she activated a tiny device from her wristband, an EMP pulse detonator. The blast was silent but instantaneous. Lights shattered, and the agent's weapon fizzled into sparks before he had time to react. Edward pulled Elara as they ran. Another figure appeared from the shadows, then another. 2 more agents in black, both with rifles raised. Elara yanked open a service hatch in the floor near an old conveyor belt. "Down here," she yelled. They slid into the shaft just as plasma blasts scorched the space above them. Edward landed hard on his side, but Elara was already on her feet, tapping coordinates into her wrist pad. "What now?" he gasped. "We run smarter," she said. "Not faster." The shaft led into an old utility tunnel, once used to transfer supplies between factories. It was lined with cables and corroded pipes. Elara ran ahead, using a homemade flashlight rigged from an old drone battery, while Edward struggled to keep pace. As they reached a junction, she suddenly stopped. Her breathing was controlled, but her eyes burned with fury. "They were never going to let me live," she said. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder.
You don't know that? Yes, I do.
She whispered. "Because I learned the truth last year." She turned and looked at him with such intensity that it silenced him. "They didn't just test us, Edward. They bred us." His stomach turned. "What do you mean?" "They wanted something more than gifted children. They wanted perfect minds, controlled variables. Our parents were chosen, paid. Some disappeared. Some didn't make it." She reached into her pocket and handed him a photo. Edward looked at it and froze. It was a grainy image. A woman with wary eyes and a lab coat, standing next to a small girl no older than 5. The woman's name tag read Dr. Elise Langston. His breath caught. That's my wife." Elara's voice was barely a whisper. She was the lead geneticist. "No," Edward whispered, backing away. "That can't be. She worked on AI, not human trials. She died in a car accident 6 years ago." "She worked on both," Elara said. "And the accident wasn't random. She tried to leak the project files. They silenced her." Edward's hands trembled. His wife, the woman he had mourned for years, part of something so horrifying he couldn't even process it. "Why didn't I know?" "They kept you isolated, focused on your work. You were the public face. She was the quiet mind behind the darker layers." He sank to the ground, unable to look at her. Elara sat next to him. "You're not responsible," she said. "You didn't know." "But I should have," he rasped. "I should have seen the signs." Silence filled the tunnel. The only sound was water dripping from somewhere far above. "I think she tried to protect me," Elara said softly. "The others, they didn't have names. Just numbers. She gave me one. Elara told me it meant the fallen star. She said even stars deserve a second life." Edward looked at her, eyes brimming. "She named you?" Elara nodded. "I didn't remember until I found the files. Until I saw her face. For a long time they sat in that hollow place, 2 broken pieces of a terrible puzzle." Finally Edward stood. "What do we do now?" "We finish what she started," Elara said, rising beside him. "We expose them. All of them." "But how?" She reached into her bag and pulled out the fail-safe drive, the quantum compression device. "There's a secure satellite uplink on the roof of Helix Corp's abandoned R&D tower. If I can patch into it, I can transmit everything. The files, the footage, the audio logs, the subjects, the names. And they won't be able to stop it. Not unless they kill me first." Edward looked at her. "Then we make sure they don't." As they turned to continue through the tunnel, a sudden rumble shook the ground beneath them. Elara froze. "They found the exit," she whispered. A moment later, water burst into the tunnel from behind them. "They're flushing us out." Edward grabbed her hand. "Then we go up." A metal ladder led to a grate overhead. Edward climbed first, pushing with all his strength. The grate groaned, then gave way. He reached down and pulled Elara up just as a flood of black water surged through the tunnel below. They emerged into the night soaked and shaking, but alive, for now. And on the other side of the city, a man in a dark control room spoke into a secure phone line. "She's moving toward Helix Tower." The voice on the other end replied coldly, "Let her. We'll be waiting." The Helix Corp R&D tower loomed like a forgotten monument, its top floors vanishing into a gray sky laced with the promise of a coming storm. The building had been abandoned after the tech bubble burst. At least, that's what the public believed. In reality, its foundations hid something far deeper than faulty finances or failed prototypes. Edward and Elara stood across the street in the alley behind a boarded-up pharmacy. Rain drizzled from above, soaking their hoods. The city buzzed around them, normal, unaware. People walked, laughed, stared at glowing screens, never realizing the war that was unfolding beneath their feet. "You're sure the uplink is still active?" Edward asked, his voice low. Elara pulled a holographic interface from her wrist pad and nodded. The satellite beacon was never disconnected. They thought no one would dare use it. "But I hard-coded a backdoor into their encryption the last time I was in the system." "You hacked into it before." "I grew up inside their code," she said, her voice devoid of pride. "I'm not an intruder. I'm a ghost they made and forgot to bury." Edward looked up at the building, rain stinging his eyes. "Then let's haunt them." They crossed the street under the cover of darkness, slipping past a half-collapsed security gate and into a maintenance tunnel. The air inside the tower was cold metallic and still heavy with the scent of old machinery. The elevator was long dead, so they took the stairs, 24 flights. Every step echoed like a memory. By the 12th floor, Edward was panting, sweat clinging to his shirt beneath his soaked jacket. Elara never slowed. Her pace was steady, her breath controlled, her mind clearly in 1,000 places at once. "Are you okay?" he gasped. "No," she replied. "But that doesn't matter." They reached the server control floor. The walls were lined with rusted machinery and dark glass panels. Elara moved with purpose, activating old nodes, linking ports, reconnecting power sources by hand. Within minutes, soft hums began to pulse through the room, like the tower was waking from a long, haunted sleep. The satellite uplink console flickered to life. Edward stared in awe as screens blinked open, lines of code scrolled, and maps lit up. Facility blueprints, surveillance grids, names, dates, identifiers. Every truth they needed was there. Elara sat at the terminal, fingers dancing across the keyboard. "The compression drive is ready," she said. "This transmission will hit over 700 servers in less than 60 seconds. It'll be mirrored and uploaded endlessly. And they can't stop it." "No," she said. "But they can still stop me." Just then, the lights flickered. Then came the sound of boots. Heavy, methodical, close. Edward turned to the stairwell. A dozen armed men in black tactical gear entered the floor, their weapons raised, helmets glowing with scanning tech. No insignia, no names. Elara didn't even look up. "Start the upload," Edward shouted. "Already did," she said calmly. The leader stepped forward, voice booming through a voice amplifier. "Subject 7E. Terminate the transmission and surrender. You've gone far enough." Elara stood facing them. "Far enough," she said. "You erased my name. You erased my childhood. You erased my mother. You made me a ghost. And now you want to burn the last part of me that remembers who I was. You were a project. Nothing more." "No," she said. "I was your mistake." Then she pressed the final key. A siren sounded on the console. Red lights lit the room. Epilogue. The files were gone, dispersed into the digital world, unstoppable. The lead soldier raised his weapon. "That was a very stupid decision." Edward stepped in front of her. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The soldier didn't hesitate. He fired. But the round never hit. The moment the trigger clicked, the room erupted in light. Elara had activated a fail-safe pulse. Every weapon jammed. Every helmet screen blinked out. The soldiers clutched their ears, staggered, momentarily disoriented. "Run," she shouted to Edward. They bolted through the far door as the floor shook from an emergency generator surge. Alarms blared. Smoke filled the halls. Behind them, the soldiers scrambled, their tech scrambled by Elara's counter-hack. They reached the rooftop access. As they burst onto the roof, the wind nearly knocked them back. Rain lashed across their faces, and in the distance helicopters began circling. Too late. Edward collapsed behind an antenna, coughing. Elara joined him, soaked, shaking, but alive. "It's done," he gasped. "You did it." She stared out at the skyline, her voice distant. "They'll deny it. But the world will know. They can't erase me anymore." Suddenly, Edward noticed her hand. It was bleeding badly. A thin stream trailing down her wrist. "Lara, I'm fine." "No, you're not." She turned to him, eyes tired. "You can't fix me, Edward. Not all the way. Too much of me was built for breaking." He held her face in his hands. "But I'll be here for every piece." A thunder rumbled. In the distance, the city lights flickered, then brightened. Somewhere across the world, a reporter opened an anonymous file drop. Somewhere else, a family read a name they thought was lost. And somewhere deeper still, the founders of Project Theta stared at their screens in horror. Because their perfect secret had just become the world's nightmare. And Elara, forgotten, discarded, hunted, was finally free. Rain drummed against the roof of the hideout like a war march. The storm had followed them across the city, painting everything in steel and shadow. Elara sat curled up in the corner of the small concrete room, her sanctuary now, a forgotten utility shed tucked behind a decommissioned metro station. It smelled of rust and mildew, but it was safe. For the moment, Edward was kneeling across from her, bandaging the gash on her wrist. His hands trembled slightly, but he said nothing. Neither of them had spoken since the escape, since the transmission. He could still hear it. Epilogue kappa. 3 words that had ignited the world. In the past 6 hours, the internet had exploded with a tsunami of data: leaked blueprints, documents, facility records, child profiles, genetic experimentation reports, and classified project logs. News anchors were stammering their way through unfamiliar technical terms. Hashtags trended globally. Protests sparked in cities. Politicians scrambled for statements they weren't prepared to make. And amid it all, one name kept echoing like thunder: Subject 7E, Elara. Edward said softly, tying the final wrap of the bandage. "We should move again soon. They'll find this place." She didn't respond. She sat stiffly, staring at the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. Her eyes were vacant. Not cold, but distant, as if she were watching something no one else could see. "Elara," he tried again. "I saw them," she whispered finally. "The kids, in the files, all of them." Edward felt a lump rise in his throat. "They numbered us," she said. "Just like me. Some of them were 6 years old. Some younger. They recorded brain response times like they were timing race cars. And when a child failed a test, they wrote one word next to their name." "What word?" "Retired." Edward closed his eyes. "I'm not the only one who got out," she said, her voice low. "But I may be the only one left who can fight." "You're not alone anymore," he said. "I am in here," she said, tapping her temple. "You can't imagine what it's like. Your entire childhood built in code and control. Every emotion dissected. Every dream watched." She looked up at him, and for a moment the brilliance in her eyes dimmed. "I don't know how to be human, Edward. I only know how to survive. You're more human than anyone I've ever met." "Then why does it hurt so much?" He didn't have an answer. Outside, the rain slowed, but the air grew hotter, thicker. Edward stood and walked to the door, peeking outside. His heart stuttered. The street was empty, but too empty: no birds, no wind, and in the distance a low mechanical hum. "Elara," he whispered. "They're coming?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the last component of the failsafe, a small detonator. Not for destruction, but for erasure. One press and the hard drive with her neural signature would melt from the inside out. No cloning, no repurposing, nothing left to steal. "They'll want me alive," she said. "But not for long." Edward turned to her. "We're not giving you to them. There's nowhere left to run. There's always another path." Footsteps echoed from the tunnel outside. Boots, dozens. Then a voice rang out. A woman's voice, amplified through a speaker. "Elara, Subject 7E, we are not here to harm you." Elara stood back straight, shoulders squared. "Lee number 1. We know what you did. You've caused chaos, but we're willing to make a deal." Elara stepped into the doorway. Rain dotted her hair like stars. "No deals," she called. "Only endings." "Elara," the voice pressed. "You're special. You know that. But the world won't accept you. We gave you purpose. Let us help you find it again." "I already found it," she said, stepping forward. Edward grabbed her arm. "Don't." But she turned to him, gently pulled away, and whispered, "They need to see me choose. That's how this ends." She walked into the street. Dozens of black-clad agents lined the edges, weapons lowered but ready. In the center stood a woman with white blonde hair, her face sharp, composed, and terrifyingly familiar. "I know you," Elara said. "Yes," the woman replied. "I was there when you were born. I held you before your mother did. You were ours, Elara. You still can be." "No," Elara said, raising the detonator. "I was never yours. I belong to no one." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You'll destroy everything we built." "Exactly." And she pressed the button. But nothing exploded. Instead, a distant siren blared, loud, urgent, inignorable. It wasn't a bomb. It was a signal. Every phone in the city lit up, every billboard, every screen. A live feed of Elara, standing in the rain, facing her creators. Her voice, amplified by the city itself, rang out, "My name is Elara. I was born in the dark, built to be a tool, raised without love. But I am not your secret anymore. I am your reckoning." The soldiers hesitated, the woman's composure cracked, and behind her, the crowd gathered: civilians, journalists, protesters filming, watching, witnessing. The firestorm wasn't bullets or bombs, it was truth. And in that moment, Elara stood taller than any tower. For the first time in her life, Elara wasn't running. She stood in the heart of the street, soaked in rain, face to face with the people who had once held her fate like a wire stretched between cruel fingers. But this time there were eyes everywhere, ordinary eyes, people, cameras, a city awake, and they were watching. Behind Elara, Edward held his breath, heart thudding in his ears as the flood of witnesses grew. What had started as a silent neighborhood had become a roaring city square. Thousands had tuned into the live stream. News helicopters circled above like vultures, broadcasting Elara's every breath across the globe. And now, she couldn't be silenced. The woman in black, Commander Ria Voss, took a cautious step forward. "You don't understand what you're doing. You've exposed things the world isn't ready for." Elara's gaze didn't flinch. "The world isn't supposed to be ready for this. It's supposed to be horrified. You think they'll protect you? Ria gestured to the growing crowd. They'll fear you? You're not one of them? No, Elara said, voice steady. But I choose to stand with them, because I remember what it felt like to be powerless. And I'd rather be feared for telling the truth than be loved for living a lie. Behind the soldiers, someone shouted, "Let her speak." Another voice joined in, "Is it true? The kids? The experiments?" Then, one by one, phones were held high, flashing, recording. Ria's team hesitated. They weren't ready for this kind of war. Edward stepped forward now, standing beside Elara. He didn't speak. He just stood there, as a father might, not by blood, but by choice. A broken man standing beside a broken child, daring the world to see them both. And it did. Elara raised her hands, not in surrender, but in declaration. I am not a number. I'm not your project. I'm what's left when a system fails, and still refuses to die. She looked directly into one of the civilian cameras. There are still children out there. Just like me. Lost in labs. Names erased, lives stripped away. They deserve to be found. They deserve a world that remembers them. And then the unthinkable happened. One of the soldiers, helmeted, faceless, lowered his weapon. Another followed. Then another. Ria Voss turned, panic flashing behind her controlled features. Stand down is not authorized. But no one listened. Because the lie had collapsed, and Elara's truth filled the void. A deafening silence blanketed the scene, broken only by the rhythm of rainfall and the quiet hum of liberation in the air. Ria looked at her fractured command and knew it was over. Without another word, she turned, signaled her remaining loyal men, and slipped into the shadows from which she had come. Elara watched her go, chest rising and falling as adrenaline ebbed and reality returned. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, softly numb, we did. The weeks that followed were a blur. Investigations exploded. Government scrambled. Whistleblowers came forward. Files matched. Lives lost in silence were given names, stories, funerals. Parents discovered their children hadn't died of illness or accidents, but had vanished into experimental programs buried under a dozen shell corporations. Project Theta became a global scandal. There were trials, denials, protests, lawsuits, but also change. Facilities were shut down. Survivors were found, some shattered, some salvageable. And in the center of it all stood the girl who was never meant to exist. Elara. She declined interviews, avoided awards, turned down documentaries. Instead, she worked quietly, relentlessly, building systems to track down the last of the black sites, publishing open-source data tools, teaching kids how to protect their digital identities. She created a small nonprofit funded anonymously, dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating children caught in the web of corporate and government exploitation. The logo, a star, broken into light. Edward stayed by her side. He sold the last remnants of Langston Technologies, using the funds to support her work. The world had called him a failure, but in the end, he'd helped raise something greater than profit. He'd helped raise hope. One afternoon, nearly a year later, Elara stood on a quiet hill outside the city. The wind was gentle, the sky open. In her hand was a single photograph, worn, creased at the edges. Dr. Elise Langston, her mother, her creator, her betrayer, her protector. She tried to save me, Elara said softly. Edward stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. She did. Do you think she'd be proud of what I became? He paused, then answered with a voice thick with truth. I think she already was. They stood there a long time, saying nothing. No speeches, no drama, just silence and sky. Elara closed her eyes, and for once there was no code running behind them. No panic, no simulations. Just peace. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer hunted. She was no longer their weapon. She was a child. She was a genius. She was free, and the world would never forget her again. Sometimes the smallest spark is all it takes to burn down an empire built on silence. This is the story of Elara.
A grieving millionaire stands at his wife's grave, lost in silence, until a little girl appears, clutching a faded letter from the woman he loved. Her trembling voice reveals a truth that shatters his world and fills the emptiness in his heart. What began as loss becomes the most unexpected bond of his life.